The chamber is silent, except for the soft rasp of a newborn's breath. You feel the weight of the child against your chest, its tiny fingers curling, searching for warmth. But the child is not yours. Behind you, candles flicker against the stone walls, throwing shadows that seem to lean closer, as though listening. Perfume and milk mix with the iron tang of the palace air. A guard watches, a maid whispers, and you, a woman torn from your own infant, are commanded to give your body, your strength, your very life to this royal heir. You taste bitterness in your throat. The cradle of your child at home lies empty, while here, in silk and marble, you are nothing more than a vessel. What does it mean to nurse the future while your own blood is left to starve? The search begins not in the palace, but in the villages. Word spreads quickly. The queen has delivered, the royal nursery waits, and the crown demands a woman whose body can feed the child who will one day inherit a throne. Messengers ride through markets and churchyards, looking for women who have recently given birth. But not just any mother will do. Her body must be strong, her milk plentiful, her health unquestionable. The midwives and physicians examine her like livestock. They press fingers into her flesh, note the richness of her skin, ask questions about her diet, her husband, even the deaths in her family. A blemish, a crooked tooth, the faintest cough, enough to dismiss her. She must be of good character. Though the definition is less about morality and more about obedience. In some courts, the test is even stranger. The milk itself is judged. A few drops are expressed into a glass, examined for color, thickness, even its ability to float in water. The nurse who passes this trial is lifted from her home with sudden swiftness, often before she has truly understood what has been taken from her. At first, her neighbors envy her. To serve the royal family is spoken of as honor, almost as if fortune itself has kissed her breast. Yet beneath the murmurs of pride, the village women exchange glances. They know what this honor costs, for the woman is not chosen because she is free, but because she is useful. That night, as she rocks her own child in her arms, she knows it may be the last time she feels its warmth. The air smells of smoke and milk. The cradle creaks softly as she leans close, breathing in the sweetness of her infant's skin. She whispers words the child cannot yet understand, words of apology, of love. Tomorrow, the palace carriage will arrive, and her body will no longer belong to her. The carriage waits at dawn, its wheels slick with dew, horses snorting clouds into the cold morning air. Inside, velvet cushions and gilded trim promise comfort, but for her, it feels more like a prison. She clutches her infant tightly, trying to memorize the weight of its small body, the rhythm of its breaths. The child stirs, mouth searching instinctively for milk, and her heart seizes with guilt. But the choice is not hers. The midwives are already at her door, their hands firm, their faces blank with duty. Her husband stands silent, torn between pride and helplessness. The neighbors have gathered too, murmuring about honor, about fortune, yet every whisper sounds like a farewell. The separation is brutal. Her child is pulled away, placed into the arms of another woman, often a poor relative, sometimes no one at all. Many of these children never see their first birthday. Starved of their mother's nourishment, they weaken quickly, fading from hunger or disease. She knows this. Every wet nurse knows this, and the guilt stains her like a scar. On the road to the palace, she stares at her milk-heavy breasts, aching with fullness. The irony twists like a knife. Her own child will go hungry, while the infant of the powerful will feast. The air in the carriage is thick with the scent of leather and damp wool. Every jolt of the wheels feels like a hammer against her chest. What haunts her most is the silence. Her arms feel suddenly empty, her lap cold. The lullabies she once sang have no audience now. The cradle songs choked in her throat. She tries to imagine her baby sleeping, tries to imagine a gentle hand soothing it, but the visions blur and collapse into dread. By the time the palace gates appear in the distance, glinting with gold and guarded by stone lions, she feels hollow. She has been chosen, not for glory, not for love, but for the milk that binds her to another woman's child, even as it tears her away from her own. The palace looms like a fortress of stone and silk, its high windows catching the light, its gates swallowing her whole. Inside, the corridors echo with footsteps, servants rushing in hushed obedience. Incense burns faintly, masking the damp chill of the halls, but beneath it she smells iron, the musk of too many bodies pressed into one place. She is led to the nursery. Not a child's room as she once knew, but a chamber draped in velvet, warmed by golden braziers, watched over by portraits of ancestors glaring down from their frames. At its center rests a cradle carved from ivory, lined with embroidered silk, and within it, the infant, the child of kings. The room stills as she approaches. Physicians observe from the shadows, midwives hover with cloths and bottles of water. A guard shifts his weight against the wall. She feels their eyes weighing her as much as the child's safety. One mistake, one falter, and she will not be forgiven when she lifts the baby. It is heavier than her own had been. swaddled in brocade, perfumed with rosewater. Its lips seek her breast instinctively, and when it latches, the room exhales. She hears the slow suckling, the wet rhythm of life being transferred. But inside, her heart fractures with every pull. This is her duty now, to nurse, to nourish, to give of herself until her body is spent. Meals will be dictated, sleep measured, her very breath timed to the infant's needs. She is praised for her strength, but the praise feels hollow. Her own child's cry echoes in her mind, a phantom wail she cannot silence. When the feeding ends, a maid takes the royal baby gently, almost reverently, and places it back in the cradle. She, meanwhile, is dismissed to a corner room, her name barely remembered. The palace has swallowed her whole. She's no longer wife, no longer mother. She is only the chosen body. The days inside the palace unfold with rigid precision, each moment carved into ritual. Dawn begins not with her prayers, but with the cries of the royal child. Before the first light touches the windows, she is summoned. Servants wash her hands with rosewater, not out of kindness but control, to cleanse her of any trace of the outside. She is given a cloth to cover her breast, lifted only when the infant is placed in her arms. Feeding is dictated by the palace clock, not the rhythm of her body. Physicians note the times in ledgers, recording how long the child suckles, how quickly it swallows. If the baby stirs restlessly, they look to her with suspicion, as though her milk itself carries blame. She must eat on command, boiled meats, grains, soups, chosen not for her taste, but for the supposed purity of her milk. Sweet fruits are rationed, wine forbidden, spices reduced to almost nothing. Every bite is policed, for she is no longer a woman with hunger, but a vessel whose only value is the nourishment she can provide. Between feedings, she is ordered to rest, not to read, not to speak freely, but to lie quietly, conserving her strength. Even her laughter, should she find it, is frowned upon. Too much excitement might sour the milk. They say she becomes a body in waiting, her entire existence narrowed to the space between one feeding and the next. At night, she is not returned to her family or to the freedom of her own home. Instead, she sleeps in a small chamber near the nursery, within reach should the infant cry. The walls are painted with gold, the bed covered in silk, but the beauty feels suffocating. Luxury without liberty is another form of chain. Every ritual, every rule reminds her, she is not here to live her life. She is here to sustain another's. She soon learns that every movement is watched, even when the nursery is silent. Eyes are on her, the midwives hovering with folded arms, the physicians scribbling in their ledgers, the chambermaids whispering in corners. Nothing escapes notice. If she coughs, if her hands tremble, if the infant fusses at her breast, the suspicion falls on her like a stone. The surveillance is suffocating. A maid inspects the linens for spots of spoiled milk. A physician pinches her arm to test the firmness of her flesh, muttering about whether she is growing weak. If she appears tired, she is scolded for neglecting her rest. If she eats too slowly, she is told she is starving the royal heir. Every aspect of her existence is measured against the health of a child who is not her own. And failure, or even the shadow of it, brings punishment. Sometimes it is the quiet cruelty of humiliation, sharp words in front of the court, whispers that she's unfit. Other times it is harsher, confinement to her chamber, denial of food she craves, or dismissal in disgrace. To be dismissed is more than shame. It means being cast back into the world, branded as a woman who failed the crown, often returned to a home where her own child may already have died in her absence. The terror is constant. She cannot soothe her own heart, cannot cry openly, cannot let her grief leak into the milk the baby drinks. The palace believes that sorrow curdles, that despair poisons, so she must smile when her body wants to weep, must appear strong even as she crumbles inside. Each feeding becomes not only a duty, but a test. A performance with her life balanced on the lips of an infant too small to know the weight it carries. At times, she's praised as if she were sacred. Courtiers bow slightly when she passes, whispering of her importance. Without her, the royal child would wither. Gifts of silk shawls or gold trinkets appear at her bedside, tokens meant to remind her that she serves the highest house in the land. They call her wet nurse, but the title is spoken with reverence, as though her milk is divine, and yet she knows this honor is hollow. She cannot eat at the royal table, cannot join the laughter of banquets. She is kept apart, too essential to neglect, too low to embrace. Her chambers may glitter with velvet, but her presence is tolerated, never celebrated. She is indispensable and invisible, worshipped and degraded in the same breath. The contradiction gnaws at her in moments of silence. When the child sleeps and the corridors fall quiet, she feels the fracture widening inside. She is told she is the chosen one, yet she remembers the empty cradle she left behind. She is praised for saving the future, yet she wonders if her own blood is starving in some forgotten corner. Sometimes she dreams she is nursing two children, the royal heir in her right arm, her own infant in the left. In the dream, both gaze at her with trust. But when she wakes, only one is real, and the other is an ache that never fades. The palace does not allow her grief to surface. If she falters, she risks punishment. If she rebels, she risks ruin. So she learns the art of silence, swallowing her pain with every bite of plain bread, masking her sorrow with the careful curve of a smile. She becomes a paradox made flesh, exalted as life-giver, erased as a woman, and with each passing day, the chains of silk grow tighter, until she no longer knows if the honor she carries is a blessing or a slow, exquisite death. For every royal child who thrived in silk-draped nurseries, dozens of infants were left behind in cold, dim cottages. The wet nurse's departure was not only a wound to the mother's heart, but often a death sentence for her own baby. Without her milk, survival hinged on chance. A grandmother who could feed broth from a spoon, a neighbor who might share what little she had, or the frail hope of a substitute nurse from the village. The numbers were cruel. In some parts of Europe during the 1700s and 1800s, infant mortality among the children of wet nurses climbed as high as 50%. Their tiny lungs weakened, their bellies swelled with hunger, their cries grew faint. Parish records list them coldly: stillborn, starved, sickly. Behind each word was a child who had once been held close, only to be forgotten by the system that tore its mother away. Stories circulated in hushed tones. A woman returned after months of service to find her child already buried, the grave marked only by a wooden cross. Another wet nurse came home to a toddler she no longer recognized, the child calling another woman mother. Some infants were given to foundling homes, where lines of abandoned babies waited for milk that never came. These children rarely lived past their first year. The cruelty was not hidden from the wet nurses themselves. They knew the risk, carried it in their bodies like a shadow. Each time the royal infant latched onto her breast, she imagined her own child's mouth searching in vain, guilt pressed into her ribs, sharp as the iron keys that locked the palace gates. The royal court spoke of honor, of duty, of service to the crown. But outside those golden halls, the fields and cottages whispered a harsher truth. For every heir fattened in luxury, another baby wasted away in silence. Though their voices rarely reached beyond the palace walls, the grief of wet nurses was not entirely silent. In cramped handwriting on scraps of paper, some tried to send word home. Letters spoke of aching breasts, of the child they rocked in gilded cradles, and the one they left behind in straw. Many begged their families, "Keep the baby warm, feed it broth, do not let it forget me." But the letters were often intercepted, censored by stewards who feared a grieving nurse might lose her strength. When letters could not be sent, whispers carried their sorrow. Servants gossiped in the laundry rooms, where the steam from boiling sheets softened tongues. They told of a nurse who wept into her pillow each night, clutching a small cloth her baby had once worn. Another was said to hum lullabies under her breath, her voice trembling as she held the royal heir. Some were even rumoured to try and send coins hidden in seams of their gowns, to buy milk or bread for their own children far away. The palace disapproved of such grief. It was called weakness, distraction, even disobedience. But among the women themselves, the mourning became a secret sisterhood. In hushed voices, they shared the names of children they might never see again. Names spoken like prayers in corridors where no one else cared. One story lingers in the records. A nurse dismissed from service because she refused to stop asking about her baby. When she returned to her village, she found a grave waiting. The villagers said they could hear her wail for days, a sound that mingled with the church bells and carried across the fields like a curse. The court had its rules, but grief found its cracks. It seeped through paper, through whispers, through the hollow songs of mothers who fed one child while another slipped into the shadows. Over time, the burden became more than flesh and milk. It became a war inside the heart. Each feeding reminded her of the impossible divide. On one side, the crown's child, nourished and adored. On the other, her own blood, fading in neglect. The fracture widened with every breath, until she no longer knew which child she truly belonged to. Some nurses tried to harden themselves, convincing their minds that duty was destiny. They told themselves their sacrifice was noble, that serving the royal family gave their suffering meaning. Yet in the stillness of night, guilt returned like a phantom. They could silence their mouths, but not their thoughts. Others rebelled in subtle ways. A longer embrace, a gentler touch withheld from the heir, as though saving tenderness for the memory of their own child. A stolen moment staring out the palace window, imagining their village, their infant, their home. These tiny acts of defiance were invisible to the court, but inside, they mattered. They were fragments of a self that refused to be erased. But there were also women who broke under the strain. Some fell into despair, their milk drying as grief hollowed them from within. They were dismissed quickly, replaced by another chosen body for the crown. Wet nurses were interchangeable. For the women, their loss was irreplaceable. The fracture became their legacy, a split identity, forever torn between two loyalties. To nurture the royal infant was to betray their own. To yearn for their own child was to risk punishment. Even dismissal, caught in this cruel bind. They lived as divided souls, trapped between honor and heartbreak. And though their names rarely appear in chronicles, their pain lingers in the spaces between lines, in the silences history has not erased. Her usefulness ends the moment her body fails. When the royal child is weaned, or when her milk dries, she is dismissed with little more than a token payment. There is no ceremony, no farewell banquet, only a quiet word from a steward. Her service is no longer required. She steps out of the palace gates with empty arms, her silken chamber already given to another woman. The gold trinkets and shawls once handed to her feel like ashes now, for they cannot fill the years lost. She returns to her village a stranger, marked by absence. Her child, if it lived, no longer knows her scent, her face, her touch. Sometimes she finds only a grave, small and forgotten, covered in weeds. Others return to children who survived, but survival carries its own bitterness. The bond is broken, the years unrecoverable. A toddler reaches for the arms of an aunt, a grandmother, anyone but her. She may still be mother in name, but in her child's memory, she is little more than a ghost, and beyond the family, society rarely welcomes her back. Villagers mutter about pride, about arrogance, about a woman who thought herself above them because she served the crown. Yet, when poverty strikes, as it so often does, the same villagers do not offer mercy. Many wet nurses, once praised as saviors of dynasties, find themselves begging for bread within years of dismissal. No record is kept of their suffering. Their names vanish from palace archives as if they had never lived within its walls. History remembers the heir, the physicians, the king who commissioned portraits of his child, but the nurse who sustained that child with her body. She becomes a shadow, folded into silence. Dismissal is not just an ending, it is erasure. The slow unraveling of a woman who once carried the future in her arms, and who now carries nothing at all. The years strip away the sharpness of her memories, but not the wound. Her body, once swollen with milk, has long since emptied. Yet she swears that sometimes, late at night, she still feels a phantom ache in her breast, as though the child was still there. Hungry and waiting, she stands before a mirror. Older now, her skin lined by time, she searches her reflection for traces of the woman she once was. The mother who could not choose which child to save. She finds none, only silence greets her. A silence heavier than grief in the village. Whispers of her role fade. To them, she is simply another woman aged by hardship. But within her, the echo remains. The image of the royal child sleeping in her arms lingers beside the ghost of her own, who may have died, nameless, faceless and alone. When she hears bells ringing for the royal heir's marriage, or the triumph of a coronation, she listens from the shadows. The world cheers, but she alone remembers that its first breath was tied to her sacrifice. She feels pride, grief, resentment, tangled so tightly that she cannot separate them. Sometimes she returns to the field where she once labored in silence, knowing her own child cried somewhere else. The earth has long since swallowed her tears, yet she kneels and presses her hands into the soil, as if searching for answers in the dirt. There are none. The story of her sacrifice was never written. No ballad sings her name. No inscription honors her loss. But in the quiet chambers of memory, her truth endures. That milk can bind strangers more fiercely than blood, and that love, when stolen, leaves scars that no one else can see. She closes her eyes and whispers to the wind. Not to the royal child, nor to the one she lost, but to herself. I was a mother, even if no one remembers. And with that, her story dissolves into silence. An echo only history's shadows will carry. The years strip away the sharpness of her memories, but not the wound. Her body, once swollen with milk, has long since emptied. Yet she swears that sometimes, late at night, she still feels a phantom ache in her breast, as though the child was still there. Hungry and waiting, she stands before a mirror. Older now, her skin lined by time, she searches her reflection for traces of the woman she once was. The mother who could not choose which child to save. She finds none, only silence greets her. A silence heavier than grief in the village. Whispers of her role fade. To them, she is simply another woman aged by hardship. But within her, the echo remains. The image of the royal child sleeping in her arms lingers beside the ghost of her own, who may have died, nameless, faceless and alone. When she hears bells ringing for the royal heir's marriage, or the triumph of a coronation, she listens from the shadows. The world cheers, but she alone remembers that its first breath was tied to her sacrifice. She feels pride, grief, resentment, tangled so tightly that she cannot separate them. Sometimes she returns to the field where she once labored in silence, knowing her own child cried somewhere else. The earth has long since swallowed her tears, yet she kneels and presses her hands into the soil, as if searching for answers in the dirt. There are none. The story of her sacrifice was never written. No ballad sings her name. No inscription honors her loss. But in the quiet chambers of memory, her truth endures. That milk can bind strangers more fiercely than blood, and that love, when stolen, leaves scars that no one else can see. She closes her eyes and whispers to the wind. Not to the royal child, nor to the one she lost, but to herself. I was a mother, even if no one remembers, and with that, her story dissolves into silence, an echo only history's shadows will carry. Her story is not an isolated tragedy across centuries and kingdoms. Countless women bore the weight of this same cruel bargain, to give their milk to another's child, while their own starved in silence. Some endured quietly, some broke under the burden, but almost all were erased from memory. History records the names of kings and queens, of heirs and dynasties. It celebrates their triumphs, their alliances, their wars. Yet beneath every royal cradle lay the sacrifice of a woman whose name never entered the archives. She was the foundation, the flesh and blood that sustained an empire, but her existence dissolved into anonymity. The cruel truth is that their devotion was not seen as love, but as duty. Their grief was not honored, but hidden. And so their lives became ghost stories, whispered through generations, never written in books, never carved into stone. To speak of them now is an act of restoration. It is to remember that behind every royal heir who lived, there was another child who did not. That behind the grandeur of palaces stood women who labored in silence, whose bodies were turned into vessels of survival. Not for their own kin, but for the lineage of power. Their names are gone, but their echo remains, the echo of milk, of memory, of loss that no crown can erase.